one question you can ask is, how is it, in fact, that one can search for the neural correlate of consciousness? Because, as we all know, there are some problems in measuring consciousness. And it's not this directly and straightforwardly observable thing. It would be a lot easier if we had a way of getting a consciousness directly and then looking for the correlate. If we had, for example, a consciousness meter. Now, to date, no such thing has been possible, something that would reach inside and get at people's conscious experiences. But I'm actually pleased to report that today, thanks to new emerging technologies, a bit of neuromorphic engineering in Christoph Koch's lab down at Caltech, that was combined with a little bit of transpersonal psychology and some quantum gravity thrown in, there's actually the first experimental prototype of a consciousness meter, which I'm just ready to unveil to you today for its first public demonstration. So here it is. And I'm going to actually do some experimental research with this. You know, they say our philosophers are armchair, or I guess it's barrel philosophers, but you know, I mean, we're going to do some field work here. So I'm going to give this this prototype a go. So I guess the first thing I'll do is, does this microphone work okay? Just briefly? Yeah. The first thing I'll do is point it at myself and see what happens. Okay. Searching for consciousness. Searching for consciousness. Searching for consciousness. Yes! I'm having a red experience right now. It seems to work. Okay, now I'll point it to my associate over here, Gwen Gesolderer, the distinguished philosopher. Gwen? Searching for consciousness. Searching for consciousness. Yes! Yes! A green experience. No. Okay, maybe I'll point it now at, let's see, it'll be Paul, or maybe Pat Churchland, back there, back in the audience, just to see how that's going. Searching for consciousness. Searching for consciousness. Very, very faint signal. Very faint signal. It's there. It's on life support, but it's there. Yes. A little bit of work that it may be found, and okay, now last test. Dan Dennett. Well, okay, there's my Dan Dennett standing over there. Okay, Dan. Searching for consciousness. 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 I'm very, very sorry, but the hypothesis has proved to be, the zombie hypothesis has proved to be correct. Okay. So that is what a consciousness meter could do for us, if we had such a thing. The searching for a neural correlate of consciousness would be straightforward. We'd wave the consciousness meter, detect consciousness, at the same time, we detect the underlying brain processes, find the correlations, and say, yeah, these processes are correlated with those lights of various kinds. We'd say that's the neural correlate of consciousness. Alas, we do not, in fact, have a consciousness meter. And I'm mostly serious from here on. What do we do without a consciousness meter? You might wonder, how can, in fact, the search go forward? Next slide. So the question is, how does, in fact, experimental research to find the neural correlates of consciousness go forward? We don't have the consciousness meter. I think the answer is that we get there through principles of interpretation of physical systems to judge whether or not they have consciousness. What we might in fact call pre-experimental bridging principles. These are the criteria that we bring to bear in looking at systems to say whether they're conscious now. A, whether they're conscious or whether they're not. And B, more importantly and more to the point in this kind of experimental work, what sort of information they're conscious of and what sort of information they're not. We don't go in there directly and reach in and measure and grab those experiences and transpersonalize them to our brain. Rather, we rely on external criteria for consciousness. Perfectly reasonable thing to do. These principles of interpretations. What sort of physical signs are we going to take as signs of consciousness? But I think when we do this, we have to realize that something interesting is going on. These principles of interpretation that we use in looking at a system and trying to decide, is it conscious, is it not conscious? They're not themselves experimentally testable, or they're not themselves experimentally determined. In a sense, they're pre-experimental. They're principles of interpretation that we bring in to interpret the results of experimental results, whatever they may be. They're based partly on theoretical judgments, conceptual judgments we might make, partly perhaps on information gleaned from the first-person perspective, on our own consciousness. And I think we're all stuck in this boat. Because consciousness is, of course, private and subjective, this point, I think, applies whether one is a hard problem believer or whether one believes there's not that much of a hard problem. Either way, the experimental work is going to require a lot of pre-experimental principles in determining these criteria for prescription, not themselves experimentally determined. Now, the presence of such principles in this work makes the field very interesting. Of course, such principles are usually left highly implicit in the search for a neural correlate of consciousness. We don't normally see a paper that says, here is such and such a bridging principle, this is what I'm using, and this is what follows. Usually they're very implicit, but I think it's very useful to make them explicit in this search for a neural correlate of consciousness, because the very presence of these principles, I think, has some pretty strong and interesting consequences in the search. So I guess I'm ready for the next slide. Yeah, we might say that these principles, in fact, the very need to rely on such principles, we can't detect consciousness directly. It makes, in some sense, in this search, we're all making a leap into the epistemological unknown. We don't tune into the consciousness directly. We've got to make that leap of faith. Maybe not a strong leap of faith, but there's a sense in which anybody engaged in this work, we're all philosophers at some level. There's all a little bit of philosophy involved in getting from the physical data to the evidence about consciousness. So let's look at a little bit of this philosophy. So what are these principles of interpretation? Well, I think the first one, and by far the most prevalent, is a very straightforward one. It's the principle of verbal report. When someone says, yes, I see that table now, we say, okay, yeah, they're conscious of that table. When someone says, yes, I'm seeing red now, we say, okay, they are, in fact, having a conscious experience of red. So you might say, well, how do you know? And a philosopher might always come back and say, well, maybe they're just a zombie. But in fact, most of us don't believe the people around us are zombies, and we are quite prepared to rely on this principle, which I think is well-grounded. So the principle here, then, is that when information is verbally reportable, it's conscious. When it's directly verbally reportable, and indeed when it's directly, of course, an actual verbal report isn't required. We're not only conscious of what we report. When information is directly and automatically available for verbal report, we're generally prepared to ascribe consciousness. So this is a relatively safe principle, widely used. Next slide. Of course, we don't want to only rely on this verbal reporting principle because it's a little bit limiting. We want to do some broader experiments, and there are broader experiments out there. In particular, we don't want to just restrict our studies of consciousness to paradigms to subjects that have language. And in fact, just this morning, we saw a beautiful example of such experiments in language-free creatures. The work by Nikos Logothetis and his colleagues, which is done over the last number of years involving monkeys. And so, how did Logothetis et al. Manage to draw conclusions about what's going on in these? What are the neural correlates of these monkeys' conscious experience without any way of getting verbal reports? Well, I think what they do is, of course, they rely on these monkeys pressing bars. You say, well, if the monkey can be made to press a bar in response to a stimulus in the appropriate way, then we'll say that information is conscious. I think what the criterion that's really at play here is that when the information is available for arbitrary response, then we're going to say, indeed, that information is represented in consciousness. If it turned out, for example, that the monkey could press a bar in response to that red light or that pattern, but it couldn't do anything else, it was only a bar pressing that happened, then we would say, in fact, we would be tempted to say, well, that's probably not consciousness, that's some kind of weird, hardwired, subconscious connection. If, on the other hand, we find information that's available for response in all of these different behavioral areas, we're prepared to, usually I think, to say, yes, indeed, there is consciousness there. So what is the underlying general principle here? I think the underlying general principle is something like, when you have information which is directly available in a cognitive system for global control, for control in a whole lot of different motor modalities, then we'll say it's conscious, and indeed vice versa, at least in a range of relatively familiar systems, such as humans and primates, and so on. So next slide. So in other words, in this methodology, I think the basic correlation is that between consciousness and something we might call, what I've called direct availability for global control, or global availability in the system for short. This seems, on the face of it, to at least roughly fit the first-person evidence, the evidence gleaned from our own conscious experience. Indeed, when we find information that is present in consciousness in our phenomenal field, it is generally reportable. It is generally information that we can bring to bear in the control of behavior in a lot of different modalities. I can talk about it, I can move my arms in the general direction of the stimulus, I can press bars, I can do all those things. So that direction is reasonably straightforward, at least in familiar cases. The other direction, where we find information that's directly available in this way for global control, it's generally conscious information at the same time, and I think one can bear this out by consideration of cases. I mean, there are interesting cases to deal with, such as blindsight, where one has some kind of availability for control. Those cases are intended to be covered by the directness criterion, the directness and automaticity of the response here, as opposed to the relative indirectness of the response in blindsight cases. And one could also stipulate, if one wanted, that the control be voluntary control, as Ned Block mentioned the other day, to handle these cases. So what I mean, this is still a very crude approximation of what the functional criteria are that come into play. One can argue about this. I'm less concerned today with the details of that functional criteria that one uses in studying the existence of consciousness than in the fact that such functional criteria are absolutely required, implicit in the methodology of all the research which takes place, and central to the program. One can, if you disagree with this criterion somewhat, for example, then you may want to come up with a refined criterion. But the point is that in distinguishing between systems that are conscious and systems that aren't, in these familiar cases, whether it's blindsight, other pathologies, and so on, we rely on functional criteria ourselves to make those choices. So we ought to be able to abstract out those functional criteria to make these decisions as an implicit part of the methodology. So now, the question is, if something like this is right, if something like this is indeed implicit in the search for a neural correlate of consciousness, and indeed at the basis of the experimental research, then what follows from this? And I think one can draw out some interesting consequences. So next slide. So I think one thing one can do, for example, is produce what philosophers sometimes call a rational reconstruction of the search for a neural correlate of consciousness. A rational reconstruction is something that, well, it doesn't work exactly like this, but if one looks at the rational underpinnings of the process, it probably would take something like this form. So in searching for the neural correlate of consciousness, one has something like a pre-experimental, theoretical bridging principle that one finds plausible on independent grounds, theoretical grounds, phenomenological grounds, and so on, such as that consciousness goes along with verbal report, or in this case, consciousness goes along with global availability, direct availability for global controls in the systems. That's the pre-empirical premise. Now one comes in and does the empirical research. One applies that pre-empirical criterion. One looks at these systems. Of course, one doesn't find the consciousness directly. One detects the functional property. One says, okay, when one sees in these systems direct availability of information for global control, then, well, that's correlated with some neural process N, 40 Hertz oscillations or whatever. So the first part is the conceptual or theoretical premise. The second part is the empirical result. And then putting these two together, one comes to the conclusion that in fact neural process N, the 40 Hertz oscillations, is a candidate for a neural correlate of consciousness. Now, of course, in practice, it doesn't work anything like this simply. The two stages are very intertwined. It may well be that as we go through experimental research, our theoretical and conceptual principles in the first case will be refined. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, I think one can separate this in an interesting way, at least at the rational level, into the pre-experimental and the empirical component. and find this conclusion. So that's something like the rational reconstruction. Next slide. So what are some kind of conclusions that we can draw from this rational reconstruction? The first, I think, is that how can we characterize these neural correlates of consciousness? I think something that follows here is that we can characterize neural correlates. Just say 40 Hertz oscillation turns out to be a neural correlate of consciousness. Whatever such correlates turn out to be, they're going to be mechanisms in the brain of global availability, of direct availability for global control. After all, we're going to find such systems precisely where there is global availability. So these are going to be the systems that, in a sense, subserve that availability. They subserve the processes that make information available in the brain. I guess the only other alternative is that these correlates might somehow be a symptom rather than a mechanism of global availability, but that ought to be, in principle, addressable and via dissociation studies, via lesioning, and so on. If it is a mere symptom, we ought to be able to dissociate the neural process from the mechanism of availability, thus showing to us that consciousness was there even when this neural process wasn't, thus indicating it wasn't in fact a perfect neural correlate after all. So it seems that what we're left with is a neural correlate of consciousness will be a mechanism of global availability. And in fact, if you look at the proposals which are out there, this seems to fit them pretty well. The 40 Hertz oscillations that were put forward by Crick and Koch were precisely put forward because of their role in binding and integrating information into working memory. What is working memory but a mechanism for global control in a cognitive system? For extended neural activity, it's entirely plausible that the extension of neural activity is relevant precisely because that's what gives information the required capacity to dominate later processes in a cognitive system. The high-quality representations, the global workspace of Bernie Barrs is particularly explicitly a proposal in this direction, a mechanism of global availability. I think the thalamocortical system is very plausibly to be seen playing this role, and so on. All of these mechanisms seem candidates for mechanisms of availability. Next slide. So second, a full story about the neural correlate of consciousness, then if we do tell the full story about the neural correlate of consciousness, it ought to simultaneously do two things. The first thing it will do is give us an explanation of global availability. The thalamocortical system, or that global workspace, those 40 Hertz oscillations, separately or together, should give us an explanation of how it is that information in the brain is made available for global control. And that will indeed be an explanation in this case, because that's a functional property. The question is one of these, quote, easy problems of how it is that certain functions are performed. And the mechanistic approach gives a very straightforward approach to that question. So this will give ultimately, in that century or two down the line, an explanation of availability. But at the same time, it will do something else. We'll then have found the processes that underlie consciousness, conscious experience, phenomenology itself, at least granted these bridging principles, because the very mechanisms that explain availability are going to correlate with consciousness. Now, I don't think that this will give us an explanation of consciousness, of course. One's still going to be able to raise the question of why it is that these very processes why these very processes of global availability should and do give rise to conscious experience, as it seems they do. As yet we have no explanation of why, and it may well be that the full details of this explanation still won't explain why. We take it that there is this brute correlation between global availability and consciousness. There is nevertheless a very strong conceptual distinction between the two. We can at least imagine one without the other. We can know about one without knowing about the other. One can explain one without explaining the other. So the hard problem remains, but be that as it may, who knows, somewhere along the line we may be led to the relevant insights that show why that link is there, and the hard problem may come to be solved. Whether or not then it explains conscious experience, we'll at least have a correlate of conscious experience. We just need to keep in mind the distinction between correlation and explanation. Okay, enough on the hard problem. Next slide. Third, I think it's fair to say that, given this paradigm, it's likely to be that there are going to be many different neural correlates of consciousness. Now, I take it that's not going to surprise a whole lot of people, but this rational reconstruction gives you a way of seeing just why this might be the case. There'll be many neural correlates of consciousness because there may well be many mechanisms of global availability in the brain. there are going to be mechanisms of availability in different modality. It may well be that the mechanisms of visual global availability are very different from the mechanisms of auditory or even emotional global availability of information. So one may find different neural correlates there. One may not. One may find a later area which integrates all of them, but that's very much an open question. There will be neural correlates at different stages along that processing path. Earlier mechanisms of global availability, later ones. They may all be candidates for neural correlates of consciousness. And indeed, there will be mechanisms at many different levels of description. Oh, I see this light's gone on. Wow. Wow, that's scary. What is happening here? What? Machine consciousness. Wow. Okay. Scary. Okay, back to the point. So there are going to be a lot of different mechanisms of global availability going around. Different levels of description. It may well be that the 40 Hertz oscillations may provide a mechanism of global availability at one level of description, and the high-quality representations, or the global workspace, may be another way of redescribing that process at a different level of description. So, in any case, it may well turn out that there are a number of neural correlates of consciousness. It may well turn out that a number of the animals in the zoo, so to speak, can coexist because they're compatible in one of these ways. I won't speculate much further on just what the neural correlates are. As we philosophers like to say humbly, well, that's an empirical question. But the conceptual issues, I think, are clarifying. So next slide. So this way of looking at things also gives one a way of thinking about the possibility, which is sometimes floated, of a consciousness module, which is sometimes disparaged, sometimes embraced. But I think it's interesting that looking at this paradigm for the search for the neural correlate, if we embrace it, if this methodology is the underlying methodology, it's possible that there could turn out, indeed, to be a consciousness module. What would it take? I guess it would require that it would turn out there needs to be some sort of functionally localizable, integrated area through which all global availability runs, along something like the picture that happens here. It needn't be anatomically localizable, but I think to qualify as a module, it would need to in some sense be functionally localizable. The different areas of the module would have to have high communication, high integration among themselves, compared to the relatively low communication and lacking integration outside the module in the connection to other areas. I take it that's usually what's taken to be constitutive of a module, this kind of functional integration and localization. That could turn out to be the case. That's another one of those empirical questions. If it does turn out there's such an area in the brain, then this could indeed work out. I think this would be something like Bernie Barr's global workspace. And indeed, I really should acknowledge in giving this talk that some of the ideas I'm putting forward are very compatible with things that Bernie Barr's has been saying for years about the role of global availability in cognitive processing. On the other hand, I'm not an expert on the empirical evidence, but it doesn't strike me as especially likely that this will turn out to be the case. It's just as likely there'll be multiple non-localizable processes of global availability in the brain. One here, different areas. No particular integration and coherence and high communication among those processes, in which case one might want to say, well, there's not really a module after all. But another one of those empirical questions. Next slide. The fifth interesting consequences applies to this question, which has been discussed much at this conference. Are the visual neural correlates of consciousness to be found in V1, in the extrastriate visual cortex, or elsewhere? And I guess given that this is the methodology behind the search for the neural correlate of consciousness, I guess the answer to this question is going to depend on which of these, if either, is most directly implicated as mechanisms of global availability. Okay, empirical question. It could turn out that both of them are. It could turn out that neither of them are particularly. The reasoning by Crick and Koch, which has been discussed a couple of times, both by Ned Block and by Christoph this morning, is that V1 is not in fact the neural correlate. V1 does not in fact contain the neural correlates of consciousness because it doesn't project to a prefrontal cortex, and it's prefrontal cortex that appears to coordinate control. Well, in this methodology, I think this actually turns out to be good reasoning. I don't know whether it's true that the prefrontal cortex is the sole mechanism for coordinating control, and I'm not sure that all the evidence is in here, but if those things are right, then I think the Crick and Koch reasoning is in fact supported, albeit somewhat indirectly, by this methodology. So I think this provides a way for Crick and Koch to perhaps answer some of the things that Ned Block said, as drawing conclusions about full-fledged phenomenal consciousness as well as access consciousness. Of course, the reasoning does depend on these somewhat shaky bridging principles, but then all work on the neural correlate of consciousness depends on such bridging principles, not themselves experimentally determined. So I don't think one needs to hold that against anybody in particular. That's just the part of the way the world works. Oh, another one. Another one. Scary. Where's Dan Dennett when you need him? Yes, yes. Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Oh dear. I guess I'm going to just have to hold it up. Okay. So, and moving on to the last slide. Okay. I think the final conclusion of this is that the search for the neural correlate of consciousness is a truly. Whoa. Okay. Hang on. I know what I'll do. Scary. I'm not going to say anything about that. I think we're discovering something very, very deep about the universe. Okay, final slide. The neural correlate of consciousness is not, in fact, I think, this gives us reason to, sometimes the neural correlate of consciousness is conceived of as the holy grail or the magic bullet in the search for a theory of consciousness that will make everything clear, make everything fall into place. We'll get out there, we'll discover the neural correlates of consciousness, and then we'll be able to find consciousness wherever it forms, wherever it arises. 40 Hertz oscillations, say, we'll find those 40 Hertz oscillations. Now we'll have the test. Well, if a system has 40 Hertz oscillations, it'll have consciousness. If it doesn't have consciousness. The thalamocortical system. Some people might say, well, if a thalamocortical system is the NCC, a system without a thalamocortical system won't, in fact, have consciousness at all. Well, this reasoning is kind of tempting, but I think, in fact, we can see this reasoning is just a little bit overextended. Given the very methodology which comes into play here, it seems that these NCCs themselves won't give us a definitive test for the presence of consciousness in other systems. The primary criterion, I think, for the presence of the correlations will remain the bridging principles that we started with, whether it's global availability or report or whatever. That's how after we got these correlations in the first place. Now, dissociate your neural correlate from that functional property, that criterion. I think all bets are off. You know, for example, in the most obvious example, 40 Hertz oscillations in a test tube. I don't think anybody thinks that's going to give you consciousness. But even across the board, given that it's the functional property, global availability or whatever that got us there, remove that, and I think the bets are just completely off. In a sense, because the search for the neural correlate of consciousness relied on the bridging principle in the first place, we can't really just, once we throw it away, it's just not clear exactly what follows. So in a sense, one can't get something for nothing here. On the other hand, I hope that what I've said suggests that in fact you can get quite a lot. I should say incidentally, I've been over this really very quickly and not in much detail. Some of the details are spelled out in more detail in chapter 6 of my book. Anyway, so in conclusion, I hope this has helped to illustrate, I guess, some ways in which neuroscience and philosophy can come together to help clarify and move forward and make progress on some of the deep problems in the area of studying consciousness. Thanks very much.
We do have time for a couple of quick questions. I want to make a brief announcement before we begin that, and that is the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness is having its board meeting immediately after this session in the Maricopa room. So for those board members, just right over at the convention center, and there is some hope to be able to have some food for that, but not promised as of yet.
What's that? All right. Oh, yeah, that's okay. Oh, okay.
Well, being on stage, I thought I'd use this privilege to ask the first question to Dave, of course. Yes, this wasn't pre-planned. My question is, Dave talked about this a little, but just to make the same point, given the way you stipulate the distinction between what you call the easy problems and the hard problem. Has anything that you told us today give us any clue about how to solve the hard problem, or any clue about the nature of phenomenal consciousness? And if not, where should we look for that?
Well, I was hoping to leave the hard problem to some extent to the side today, because I think the kind of things I said today are relevant both to hard problem believers and to hard problem disbelievers. Nevertheless, I think the kind of thing I've said today can at least give us some kind of way forward in helping to address the hard problem. After all, what I'm doing here is we're starting to look at the correlations which underlie the relationship between physical processes in the brain and conscious experience oneself. I think to find a theory of consciousness, the relevant kind of theory of consciousness, is going to be a theory of that bridge. What we need to do to find that bridge is first find some really relevant systematic correlations between physical processes and consciousness. I think, for example, the mechanism, the suggestion I put forward today, the correlation between global availability and consciousness is suggestive. I think one can flesh that out in a more systematic way and talk about the structure of information which is made available for global control and the structure of consciousness. This still gives us relatively high-level correlations, and as does probably the work which on this subject in neuroscience. Brain state B gives us conscious experience Y, brain state C gives you conscious experience Z. High-level correlations, not very fundamental. Nevertheless, that's something to start with. What we want in the end, as we find elsewhere in physical theory, is not just a bunch of correlations, but the underlying simple systematic principles which are going to underlie the theory for consciousness. So sometimes I say that an answer to the hard problem is going to require a fundamental theory, a theory of the simple systematic connections between physical processes and conscious experience. What I've said today is can be construed maybe as just as a small step in that direction. What we eventually need to find are simple fundamental principles, plausibly part of the rock bottom structure of the whole system, perhaps even the rock bottom structure of nature, which underlie this very connection.
One more brief question on this side.
Yes. I wonder if you see introspection as being a separate source of information about consciousness, not necessarily an infallible source of information, but a source that has some validity in its own right. If you don't agree with that, and if you would just say that we would look at external observations of behavior and utterances and so on, then would you go along with Daniel Dennett's heterophenomenological approach, where you just take reports about introspection as reports, a kind of a story you tell yourself about consciousness?
Oh, I think heterophenomenology is a great method. I mean, there's no question that many people working in the field of consciousness research use heterophenomenology. Verbal reports do, as I said, give one a lot of data about people's conscious experience. It's not the only source of information, however. And I think you're indeed quite right to say that at bottom we have to rely on introspection somewhere. Without introspection in a theory of consciousness, one just loses touch completely with the data. Because the data about one's first-person phenomenology, of course, comes in the first place from one's introspection. Now, that's not to say that introspection is completely infallible, that one takes these data as gifts from God. When one introspects, one has to reflect on possible ways that one can go wrong, ways in which one might have been misled, treat those data very carefully. Nevertheless, I think if we are going to build a theory of conscious experience as such, we have to invoke phenomenological data, connect them to the physical data. Without the phenomenological data, one will be left with only one side of the story. So I think we have to bring the two together.
Thanks very much. We're going to be hearing more about phenomenology, of course, this afternoon. In the 12th plenary session, we'll be beginning promptly at 1:40 with phenomenology and experiential approaches. Have a good lunch.
Just found out about each other.
Thanks. Did you use the microphone properly?
Yeah.
Yeah. I did. Good. Thank you.
That's a wonderful machine.
Oh, it's great. That's right. When is it coming in?
I don't know. Yeah.
So, at any rate, we just found out that we found